there's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
Download Veely today.
To be that English Rose just singing sweetly. There was something else in her voice, an expression, an emotion that transcended the purity. Although, of course, she had that purity. You know, I mean, it is a wonderfully pure instrument she had there.
Emerging from the mid-1960s folk revival, Sandy Denny represents one of the most important female singer-songwriters to have graced British music. During an eclectic career spanning 2 decades, her energy and creativity helped to revolutionise British folk music, while the breadth of her talent contributed a body of work that transcended traditional and generic sensibilities.
Simon Nicol, Fairport's long-serving rhythm guitarist, said that when Sandy came in, she stood out like a crystal glass in a sink full of dirty dishes.
And I don't understand why, you know, there hasn't been a massive kind of rediscovery of Sandy Denny, because she's one of the greatest singers this country has ever produced.
A crazy lady.
This is a critical review of a folk icon, one of the most unique and enduring voices in the history of British music. When Sandy Denny, an 18-year-old art student from Wimbledon, first appeared in the pubs and clubs of the London folk scene, the folk fraternity was in a state of flux. A conservative movement, often preoccupied with heritage and tradition, British folk was being shaken up by the new radicalism and creativity of the mid-60s. Inspired by Dylan and the young American singer-songwriters, a new generation of British artists had started to reinvent the folk scene, and it was in this atmosphere that the young Denny began to explore her music.
There were 2 folk scenes at the time. There was the old guard, which was Ewan McCall, Bert Lloyd, Peggy Seeger, who ran the Singers Club, who kind of set themselves up as the kind of be-all and end-all of how the folk revival should work. This was, you know, they set out this dictum of you only sing songs from your own tradition and set very hard and fast, rigid approach to folk music. And that was one aspect of it, but the other side of it was a much younger element, where people like a whole kind of singer-songwriter guitar boom emerged with you know, people like John Renborn, who knew Sandy very well, and Bert Jansch and Ralph McTell. Those kind of people came from. And there were 2 very distinct elements to the folk clubs around that time.
There wasn't much of a folk scene to start off with, right? There was a kind of like an R&B scene, and a skiffle scene, and the folk scene kind of merged into that lot. And it was pretty mixed, you know. And when people talk about the folk scene, they often think about the clubs that emerged, but they were split between very traditional clubs, like the Singers Club, and very unorganised clubs like the Cousins, which really wasn't a folk club at all, really. And Sandy fitted into the unorganised clubs more than the traditional clubs. She was singing kind of as a real amateur down in Wimbledon when I was down at the art school there, and I used to meet her in the pub there, and she was always terrific fun and sang and bought people drinks and was a great girl, you know. And then she got involved in the art school that I was at, which was Kingston, where there was a lot of that stuff happening. The Yardbirds came from there, Eric Clapton had been there, was playing with John Mayall, and there was a singer there called Gina Glazer, who was an American singer that was really, really good. And Gina was from America and knew Jack Elliott and Daryl Adams and Paul Clayton and Dave Van Ronk. and had a nice repertoire and a good way of singing. And Sandy got very friendly with Gina and learned a lot of songs from Gina. And the first songs that I heard Sandy singing up in London on the so-called folk scene were the ones that Gina had taught her. And she played a bit of guitar and used to come down to the Cousins, which was the basement club in Greek Street. Got friendly with a guy called Jackson Frank, the singer, who played really nice guitar and wrote songs. He influenced her quite a lot. She began to play real nice guitar accompaniments. But I wouldn't say that she slotted right into the folk scene as such, not that there was much of one.
Just like anything, to sing, to sing, to sing.
It was an astonishingly diverse scene, always was. You have to remember that in London, at its peak, there were 400 clubs, 400 folk clubs in London. You know, now, how many are there? A couple of dozen, I would say, at the most. 400. And they were filled with all sorts of different people. There was a really quite a healthy, thriving folk club scene. Most major cities had at least 1, 2 or 3 clubs going where singers would go and sing the traditional songs. It wasn't very sexy. And I think one of the things Sandy brought to the folk scene at that time was a certain sexiness. I mean, she was very good looking, very striking, that blonde hair framing her face, and of course that incredible voice.
In 1966, having spent a year performing at folk clubs around London, Denny secured a weekly residence at Le Deuce in Soho. The media began to take an interest in her performances, and in November she was invited to perform on the BBC radio programme Cellar Full of Folk.
Well, here's someone making a very rapid return visit to the folk song cellar, and I must say a very welcome one. Mind you, it's quite easy for her because she lives just down the road in Wimbledon. She is Sandy Denny. And I'll ask Sandy now to tell you all about her song.
This is a Gaelic song I'd like to sing to you. It's got a Gaelic chorus, but I won't ask you to join in. It's called Fira Vata, or The Boatman.
Often haunting the highest hilltop, I scan the ocean, I sail to sea. Wilt come tonight, love? Wilt come tomorrow? Or ever come, love, to comfort me?
She had no time for the McCall approach. You know, a lot of the singers, the revival singers, will tell you that you have to look back into the sources, and you know, all these great scholarly students of the folk revival would spend hours and hours researching material at Cecil Sharp House and go out in the country trying to find the old traditional source singers and learn from them. And Sandy had no time for any of that. You know, she was her genius, if you like, her talent was in a very natural interpretation of those songs. And though she was drawn to traditional songs, she had no interest in the oral tradition, which, when you listen to her, is very odd, because she has a real kind of depth and understanding of that whole kind of folk tradition, but it's entirely natural.
be true.
I mean, the British folk scene in the mid-60s was hugely influenced by the Americans in general, and in particular by Dylan. And just as it was in America, Dylan going electric at Newport in 1965 was a seminal moment. But then there were all these American singer-songwriters in London, people like Paul Simon and Jackson Frank. So there was this very strong American singer-songwriter influence, whether it was electric or acoustic, which, in a way, the British folk scene didn't really have at that point. I mean, it came from America. I mean, the British folk scene was still very much based in traditional material. There weren't many people around writing their own songs at that stage.
A regular at the Cousins Club, a favourite haunt of the American singer-songwriter community, Denny developed an ambition to write her own original material, and in late 1966, after a brief stint appearing with the Johnny Silvo Folk Four, she was invited to join Dave Cousins' folk trio, the Strawberry Hill Boys, later known as the Strawbs. The band swiftly recorded an album largely comprised of Cousins' own pop material, though the standout track was an original Denny composition, Who Knows Where the Time Goes.
The Strawbs were always a platform for the songs of Dave Cousins, and pretty well all the songs on that album are Cousins songs, which are very good. I mean, they fit nicely into that sort of folk, acoustic singer-songwriter movement that Sandy was very much a part of. Very pleasant, very nice. You know, it's intriguing to think what would have happened if she stayed with the Strawbs, because they of course became quite big in the early 70s. But the one thing that everyone remarks on of that Strawbs album, which features Sandy, was of course it marked the premiere of Who Knows Where the Time Goes, the first version of her best-known song, and she fitted in very well. I mean, it was quite a spontaneous thing. I mean, I remember Dave Cousins said he saw her sing. He saw Sandy singing at the Troubadour, and he said, you know, she looked and sang like an angel. And it was immediately, he just said, you know, do you want to join my group? And she said, yeah, okay, go on. And that was it. And it was just for this one album that they did in Sweden, because Cousins had a contact out there to get some cheap studio time. And it's a really nice sounding record. And I think it gives an indication of it's almost sort of a Fairport sound. It's before Sandy joined Fairport. And her reading of Who Knows Where the Time Goes, it's not as confident as it would be when she came to record it a couple of years later. But there's obviously a real talent there. And of course the voice is just fantastic.
It's a staggering song for a young girl to have written. I mean, I guess it's born of that sort of first stirrings of equating one's emotions with the seasons and the natural world. What I think in literature, when people like Coleridge did it, they called it the pathetic fallacy, that there is some echo in our emotions of the elements and the natural world. You know, and that song is born of that, and perhaps it was a song that only a teenager experiencing those feelings for the first time could have written.
I do not fear the time. For who knows how my love grows? Who knows where the time goes?
I prefer that version to the one she recorded later on. That kind of simplicity and the lovely guitar accompaniment. Actually, I found that version of that song, you know, much more heartfelt than the later one. So from that aspect, it wasn't a great album. It was, you know, she wasn't very thrilled by it herself and was kind of very reluctant to have it released. But Yeah, it's interesting from a kind of a scholar of Sandy and the folk music generally. And as I say, I do love that version of Who Knows Where the Time Goes.
The recordings she did with the Strawbs are, if you like, you know, the juvenilia. I mean, it's the first steps towards greatness. But I think you can hear that it's all there, it's all in place, or it's all at least in formation.
For my money, they were all feeling their way. You know, so I tend not to. Excuse me, forgive me. I tend to discount that album. I think it's a must-have for Sandy completists, but I don't think it represents her at her best. I don't think she really got to her best until she found someone who she considered to be her equal, or probably better than her, if you like. But you'd need to talk to her about that, and that's Richard Thompson. As soon as she starts to work with Richard Thompson, and then with Swarb, the creative fur begins to fly, and that's interesting.
By 1968, British folk music was struggling to find an equilibrium. Though the influx of American artists had inspired a wave of creativity throughout the scene, the darling of the movement, Bob Dylan, had precipitated an identity crisis which the folk community was yet to resolve.
It was the Americans, visiting Americans like Bob Dylan and Paul Simon and Tom Paxton and Phil Oakes, who injected a bit of urgency, a bit of immediacy to the folk club scene in Britain in the early 60s. And there was this tremendous schism when Dylan went electric in 65. I think a lot of people felt it was a betrayal because electric music was associated with pop music, which was seen as commercial. And there was an authenticity and an integrity to folk music, to unaccompanied singing, or to singers going into clubs accompanying themselves on guitar. There was a certain purity to that, and Dylan's electric switch was seen as a defection. So it created quite a schism in the folk community.
Fantastic, very good.
Rank. Excellent.
It was lousy, it was pathetic, he was great.
He's just doing what he wants to do, isn't he? You know, if you don't like it, surely cut out. Huh?
Said on the
See
ticket
Bob
you
Dylan,
came
not
to
a
see
pop
Dylan,
group.
not a group.
Not a pop group. No. How many pop groups like that?
You have to remember that there were a whole lot of academics at the time for whom electricity was Satan. And a lot of these academics tried really hard to get some of these urban blues guys who were playing electric music, like Muddy Waters and John Lee Hooker. They saw it as their duty to try and get them back to acoustic music. And they got Muddy Waters to make an acoustic album, and they got John Lee Hooker to make an acoustic album. They'd invented something and weren't being allowed to do it by somebody who had a problem. It wasn't a musical problem, it just had a problem. And the problem they had was with electricity. You know, you're a country musician, you know, you're a country blues man, you know, you've got to wear overalls and a hat that's been sat on by 15 cows, and you know, you've got to be covered in sheep crap or cow crap or whatever. You can't, you know, and then you've got to start wailing, and then I understand that that's the blues. But so when you've got that background, along comes Bob Dylan, or anybody for that matter, with a blues band. Was it the Butterfield band he was playing with? It was, wasn't it? And starts playing this stuff that he put on that Bringing It All Back Home album, which me and my mates listened to, and we loved it. We just, it was like having two albums. You had all that stuff, you know, I wake up in the morning and there's frogs inside my socks on one side, and then on the other side you had The Gates of Eden, and you had It's All Right Ma, and you had Baby Blue, and it's just sensational stuff. the breadth of the man was extraordinary. And there were a lot of people on the scene who loved it. And I think actually a lot of them felt it necessary to keep their heads down. Because there were those who regarded it as Satan.
It was in this climate that the young Denny, a huge Dylan fan, was striving to articulate a direction. She played the Strawbs album to Joe Boyd, a music entrepreneur and sometime Pink Floyd producer, who suggested that she leave the Strawbs and go solo.
I think she was kind of torn. I don't think she knew what she wanted to do in her early days. Whether she wasn't confident, she was always totally insecure. So although she was writing songs, she didn't really have that confidence to go out on her own and sing her own songs. So she was obviously a great singer. That was very evident early on. But in terms of her own career, I think she was kind of looking around to see what was going to work for her. I mean, she said at one point she wanted to be a jazz singer, and I think people around her, one or two people said, jazz is, forget folk music, you should be a jazz singer. And I think she did down the years. She tried the odd jazz thing, but she just had this kind of majesty in her voice that kind of came through through folk music, through traditional songs particularly, but also in her own songwriting once she got the confidence to get up and perform them.
I think the thing about Sandy Denny was she was a composite of many different musical influences. She grew up in that British folk scene, played the folk clubs, but she was a young teenage girl. She wasn't of the same generation as Ewan MacColl and those people who were that bit older, so she was far more open and receptive to influences from the rock and pop world and from America in particular. There was a rock and roll party girl inside Sandy Denny, as we all know, along with the sort of purity of the folk voice. She was, if you like, an amalgam of Joan Baez and Janis Joplin.
Denny's recording with the Strawbs had made a lasting impression on Boyd, who in 1968 was attempting to shape a successful enterprise from the young British rock band Fairport Convention.
When Fairport began, which was middle of 1967, the scene had changed from being pop, if you like, into rock. I mean, 67 is sort of year zero in many ways. I mean, it's when pop became rock and album sales began to overtake single sales. Albums were seen as statements by groups like the Beatles and the Stones. The Doors, Velvet Underground, Cream, all these people were making statements on long-playing records. Fairport were very much influenced by Dylan, by Leonard Cohen. It was very much an American influence.
And this is so confusing, it's tearing me apart.
In its first incarnation, Fairport Convention were often referred to as the British Jefferson Airplane. They weren't really part of that traditional folk world. Obviously their repertoire included songs by American singer-songwriters, and they were very interested in that lyrical side of songwriting, which kind of pushed them in a folk direction. But really, I mean, they were a 1960s rock band with certain interesting influences, and a not very beathy rhythm section, which again made them sound more folky. And then Sandy Denny came along, and that, of course, all changed.
By spring 1968, Fairport were finding it increasingly difficult to refine their sound. The band's female vocalist, Judy Dybel, appeared to be out of her depth, and the group sought to replace her with a new female lead.
After Judy left or was asked to leave Fairport, because Fairport had this image of being the guy's band with the girl singer, they held auditions at some pub in Fulham, I think, and they thought they were auditioning girl singers, and Sandy thought she was auditioning them. And there was a lovely quote. Simon Nicol, Fairport's long-serving rhythm guitarist, said that when Sandy came in, she stood out like a crystal glass in a sink full of dirty dishes. So from fairly early on, it was apparent that she was right for them.
She revolutionised the Fairport Convention, you know, from what they were before, kind of this British version of those West Coast American bands. And she came kind of storming in and became their heart and soul. You know, they tell the story of when they auditioned her to be their new singer. In fact, it was the other way around. You know, she auditioned them. She was like getting them to play stuff and deciding whether they were good enough for her rather than the other way around. And she, by the force of her personality and the force of her talent, you know, she became instantly the heart and soul of it.
With Denny in the band, Fairport's members were lifted into a whirlwind of creativity. The band began performing and recording almost instantly, fusing rock music with Denny's folk influences to create a radical sound. In January 1969, Fairport released What We Did on Our Holidays, their first album with Denny as vocalist.
Fairport Convention changed dramatically from the moment Sandy Denny joined, because what she was bringing to them, it was less her own songwriting at that stage, but a whole repertoire that she brought in from the folk clubs and from her background. And this really opened up a new vista for Fairport Convention. They'd never actually recorded a traditional British folk song until Sandy came along and that first album she made with them, What We Did on Our Holidays.
She brought out the best of the other people in the band, particularly Richard Thompson. You know, it's like there was a real empathy between the two of them. You know, this shy guitarist who stood at the back of the stage with his back to the audience because he was so shy. Suddenly, you know, he had an outlet with Sandy, and he became this brilliant songwriter. And he started writing songs specifically with her. You know, on that album, you know, the outstanding song, still one of the greatest songs that Richard Thompson's ever written, is Meet on the Ledge. You know, and even though Ian Matthews' part sings it, you know, it's very much Sandy's tour de force. Such a powerful, evocative song about death and, you know, passing of time. And she just delivers it with such passion and power.
Making songs, or finding better words. These ideas never lasted long. The way is up along the road. The air is growing thin.
Fairport's anthem to this day is Meet on the Ledge, one of Richard Thompson's very earliest compositions. And even at the time, it had that anthemic, rather epic feel to it. And some great singing from Sandy on there, some great singing from Ian Matthews, and terrific choral chorus. I mean, it's a great song.
Meet on the ledge. We're gonna meet on the ledge. When the time is up, I'm gonna see all of my friends. Meet on the ledge. We're gonna meet on the ledge. If you really need.
I think that was certainly one of Fairport's first disappointments, and I think one of Sandy's first disappointments was that Meet on the Ledge wasn't a hit. I think it came out before Christmas '68, and it sort of got lost in the rush. And I think she always thought that joining Fairport was quite a commercial move. It got her out of the folk clubs. It got her into a band with a record deal, with a recognised producer. And I think Meet on the Ledge was the one that they all thought was going to do it. So there was so going into 1969, there was a slight period of disappointment that it hadn't made it. They were, schlepping up and down the M1 in the van, and getting good reviews, getting pretty regular work. But I think they all felt that was the song to take them up a notch, and it didn't quite do it. But it still sounds great.
Oh, What We Did on Our Holidays is a terrific album that stands the test of time. And it is one of the first great classics of British folk rock. Tremendous songs on there, tremendous arrangements, and great variety. You've still got the covers of American singer-songwriters. You've got Richard Thompson coming into his own as a songwriter. You've got traditional material, which Sandy brought with her, things like She Moves Through the Fair, and the emergence of Sandy herself as a songwriter with Fotheringay. So all of those elements are there on that record, and it's just a tremendous collection of songs, and really quite a seminal record in the emergence of English-British folk rock.
It's a sort of continuation a bit of what they were, the cover versions. There's the Dylan song, I'll Keep It With Mine, which he didn't release officially for years. They picked up on that quite early. Fairport were always very good interpreters of Dylan. They did very nice covers of Dylan songs. But the only Sandy original is Fotheringay, which was the song inspired by the visit to the castle where Mary Queen of Scots was imprisoned. Classic Sandy, beautiful, doomed, romantic, misty, sort of oldie worldy song. Fantastic, beautifully sung.
How often she has gazed from castle windows all, and watched the daylight passing within her captive wall, with no one to heed her call.
I think she always had that kind of natural sense of history. I don't think it was anything she studied particularly, but she'd heard a lot of folk music. She'd been around the folk clubs, sang traditional songs herself, heard other people singing it, and I think that was her attempt to kind of draw on that tradition and interpret it in her own way. Whether it was conscious or not, I've no idea. I would imagine it would have been. And the fact that she kind of got away with it and was respected for it, I think it is, proves that she was an exceptional talent.
Her days of precious freedom forfeited long before, to live such fruitless years behind a guarded door. But those days will last no more.
She was considered to be a bit of a what's the word I'm searching for? The leader of the pack, really, because she was the only singer that had one foot firmly in the folk clubs and the other one in a rock band. So it was unusual, and in those days it was unusual to be a composer as well. There weren't very many people who, I guess there was a handful, and no other woman that I can think of who wrote their own stuff and performed in folk clubs and in a rock band.
Inspired by the breakthrough of What We Did on Our Holidays, Fairport Convention enthusiastically pursued the musical avenues opened by Denny. The band performed regularly, exploring the potential of dragging traditional folk into the electric era.
Pentangle was on the road, so I missed out on the beginning of that stuff. So I got some time off and I got back and they were playing at the festival hall, so I got into that gig to hear her and say hello. And as I was going in, Maurice Rosenbaum, who was a critic for the Telegraph, I think, was coming out, going, "Oh, Yves, the volume is driving me mad." And Mrs. Rosenbaum was leading them through. They were pretty loud, And I got in, and they were singing Rain or Nine, and she was stumping away with bare feet, and Richard Thompson was playing great, and Swarbrick was in the band, and it was really great. So I thought it was fantastic. And she was in her element. It was really, really, it was exciting because they'd created that sound, And you could tell it was just, she'd blossomed. It was lovely, you know.
The electrification of all this stuff was something that was waiting to happen. The only reason it hadn't happened before was money and space. You know, if you're going to plug in your electric guitar, if you're going to play an electric guitar, there is, in my opinion, no sense in turning it down to lounge. You know, you've got to turn the bastard up. That's what it's for.
Anybody who was involved with Fairports at that time will tell you that this new direction was essentially coming from Sandy. You know, I mean, they were very happy to go along with it, and Richard Thompson loved it, and Ashley Hutchings loved it. But really, the whole impetus for this fusion of traditional British folk and rock music, I think, comes with Sandy and from Sandy, and I'd be surprised if they had gone in that direction without her. She was very much the driving force for that.
Because she'd come from the folk scene, from the folk club, she knew about folk songs, and Ashley Hutchings, particularly, who had effectively been their leader, was totally enamoured by this new direction that he saw her taking the band, and just threw himself totally into English traditional music and thought that's the way to go.
Despite the optimism surrounding Fairport's new direction, the band's internal dynamics were also evolving, with male vocalist Ian Matthews cutting an increasingly peripheral figure. In early 1969, Matthews left the band as Fairport began work on their next album, Unhalf Bricking. Violinist Dave Swarbrick was asked to join Fairport in the studio as a guest on their effort to reinterpret a 19th century folk song, Sailor's Life, as an 11-minute rock epic.
I knew Sandy, of course. I'd known her quite some time by the time of Unhalf Bricking. But Ashley had it in his head that he wanted to do a traditional track. And the more I think about it now, Sandy may have had it, may have sung it to Ashley, you know, so it's difficult to know quite how. But the Sailor's Life was a song that Sandy sung in the clubs. And Ashley, I guess, thought to enhance it. Well, mind you, Sandy and I were kind of friendly by then, so Sandy, it's hard to say. I wasn't there when they went through it, but at least ways it was Ashley that asked me if I'd like to come along and do it as a session.
A sailor's life, it is a merry life. He robs young girls of their heart's delight.
Well, the song is, I think of it as sort of like an 18th century song, in its origins. A lot has happened to it since. There's no purity in folk song. It's and there are no definitive versions in folk song. That's why you get a million versions of each song. But it's what Fairport brought to it. It was something, it was something that was waiting to happen. They really did achieve something when they did Sailor's Life. They just basically sat in the studio and went for it. And it's very, very interesting and very exciting. But Sandy pulled it off. Sandy knew what to do with the song. There are other singers who've tried it who don't know what to do when they get a band with them. But Sandy was someone who understood the mechanics of a band. She understood that she was the boss. She's standing there, she's singing the song, it's down to me. I'll sing you the song, and you people just tag along, keep hold of the shirt tails with your teeth like that, just follow. And then do whatever the hell you want, but don't get in my way. And they knew that. Richard knew that. Swarb knew that from years back. He knew that from working with me. He learned it originally working with the Ian Campbell group. He knew when to, you know, he knew when to sit back and just underpin the song, and he understood that there was going to come a moment when he could let fly, and that's what he did. Same with Richard. They all understood the principle, and folk song can thrive in those conditions. Of course it can, because it's a loose-limbed entity. It's infinitely changeable. It always has changed. It is, like I say, of its nature, progressive.
Sailor's Life was the crossover track, this big epic ballad that was quite a well-known song in folk circles, but they invested it with this kind of real drama and raw power. And that, again, it brought out the best of Richard Thompson. You know, his guitar work on that is sensational. And Sandy's his vocal performance is so kind of passionate, and this kind of simmering power that she puts out. And she's always been a great storyteller. And that was kind of one of her fortes. She could tell a great story. And this whole kind of story, tragic ballad came out, and this immense background, very powerful kind of rock undercurrent to it. It was a huge track, and it had a massive impact.
They and producer Joe Boyd really felt this is it. They had Dave Swarbrick on board, who was an esteemed violinist on the folk scene. I mean, one of the real stars of the British folk scene. And they felt with him on board, tackling a traditional song like Sailor's Life with a slightly Eastern feel to it, they really were moving on a pace. They were leaving behind the sort of Fairport as American covers band.
Sailor's Life is a milestone in Fairport's career, and it really leads the way to Liege and Leaf. I mean, again, I think the song really came from Sandy's folk club repertoire, and the story famously is, and Richard Thompson has assured me this is true, it emerged from a jam backstage at a gig at Southampton University. When they were waiting to go on, and Sandy started singing this song in the dressing room, and they joined in. And yes, it's got that sort of droning, almost raga rock quality, which in fact they had explored to an extent on the previous album, not in the context of taking a traditional folk song, but the sound is there in a more general fashion. But I mean, that was an absolutely groundbreaking piece of music, because it was, I think, pretty much the first time that anyone had taken a traditional folk song like that and then used it as a vehicle for a style more associated with progressive rock of solos and jamming and extended instrumental passages and so on and so forth. So yeah, absolutely milestone recording, and you know, that album. I mean, Richard Thompson himself thinks it's a better album than Liege and Leaf, and he may well be right. But it's a Sailor's Life that really creates the template for what they then did in such spectacular fashion on Liege and Leaf.
Unhalf Bricking appeared in the UK in July 1969 with a single release to promote the album Si tu dois partir, a Dylan cover sung in French, earning the band their first chart entry.
Yeah, I think they were as surprised as anyone when their cover of the Dylan song got them onto the top of the pops. I mean, it was done. I think Richard said it was, you know, a jokey sort of Cajun style effort of a fairly obscure Bob Dylan song. They translated Schoolboy French. Backstage, they tried it out, seemed to go down quite well, so they bunged it on the album, was released a single, and it became a hit. There was a clear distinction. It's hard to believe now, but I mean, back then, back in '69, there's a very clear distinction between underground acts like Fairport and chart acts like, you know, Marmalade or Dave D, Doty Beaky, Mick and Titch. I mean, the latter would very much go for the charts, and Fairport, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin was sort of, they felt that their statements were made better on album and at gigs. So there was a very clear distinction between acts back then. So for Fairport to sort of cross over to the charts, it was quite a surprise. But I think they were quite gratified and quite delighted. And I don't think any of them would have minded a bit more commercial success.
Unhalfbricking really as a showcase for the variety and diversity of Fairports, and you know, these two fantastic songwriting talents in Sandy Denny and Richard Thompson, and the arrangements and treatments they gave traditional material. It's all there on that record.
Though Unhalfbricking had given Fairport their biggest commercial success, its release was mired in tragedy. In May 1969, the band's tour bus had crashed on the M1 motorway, killing both drummer Martin Lamble and Richard Thompson's girlfriend Jeannie Franklin. In the aftermath of the crash, Dave Mattacks joined Fairport on drums and Dave Swarbrick became a full-time member of the band.
I knew what had happened and I went into that situation. I think Dave Swarbrick probably was much more influential on the band and bolstered them musically. I'd like to think that both Swarbrick and myself had a positive effect as outsiders coming in. We had the right kind of disposition, and Swarb was much more familiar with that whole world. I was kind of a bit kind of deer in the headlights, but hopefully we both brought something to the table.
In summer 1969, Fairport regrouped to begin work on furthering the project, started with Sailor's Life, of updating historical folk compositions. The band retreated to a house in Farley Chamberlain, a deliberate seclusion in which to put together their groundbreaking album, Legion Leaf.
I think it was a masterstroke to go out in the country and all live together and sort themselves out. And do the whole Farley Chamberlain thing, because it gave them the opportunity to kind of work out the new direction. They'd done A Sailor's Life. They knew they were breaking new territory. They knew it worked, and they had the confidence to go and do it. And they come out of this trauma, and it gave them an incentive. It gave them a direction, and they went for it. And you know, that album, Legion Leaf, came out of it, and it changed everything.
I think that the notion of getting it together in the country probably did have quite a profound impact on Legion Leaf. You know, if you're spending that concentrated amount of time together as a band, living under the same roof, you know, that's probably where the concept comes from. You know, if you're all going home to your own little abodes every night, then the album probably tends to sound more like a collection of disparate songs, like on Unhalfbricking, where you've got all these different facets of what Fairport do. So perhaps that notion of communal living while the album was being conceived and put together and recorded helped lead them in the direction of the concept they came up with.
And none of us saw it as being desolate. Like I said before, we were all pals, and here we were living together. And the outside world didn't count for much, you know. It was just somewhere where you went out and got your bread and so on. And I mean bread. You know, fish and chip shop at the pub, that kind of thing. We were all pals living together and having fun. Rehearsals were fun, you know. Some nights I know we used to quite well. We used to go in there and busk every now and again when we'd get skins, and Fairport used to go in there and busk. We just had a good time. I think it was a great idea, and I think it worked. I think Leeds and Leaf perhaps wouldn't have come together any other way.
It still knocks me dead when I hear Matty Groves, which is one of the classic traditional ballads. You know, it's a huge song. This story about, it's got everything in that song. You know, it's about betrayal, it's about murder, it's about this kind of king who goes away and his wife has a fling with this Matty Groves, and then he comes back, somebody betrays him, and he comes back and he kills them both, you know. This is this is heavy stuff. And there's been lots of versions over the years, but honestly, that version that Fairport do on Liege and Leaf, still, for me, it still knocks them all into a cocked hat, because it's the story that you know, Sandy's voice is just soaring above. There's all this band going on, this whole kind of power, incessant energy there, and the drama's building, and then there's Sandy telling the story above it all.
And a servant who was standing by and hearing what was said, he swallowed Donald, he would know before the sun would set.
I have to say that it wasn't really till about 18 months or a couple of years later that it dawned on me what the band was trying to do and the effect that it had. At the time, what I was doing was responding literally to the music that was around me, that was presented to me. Some songs that sounded good and some dance tunes, and I responded in that way. I didn't really kind of get it until later. And I hope that what I did kind of contributed. But what I obviously realised was that Sandy was a great singer, and between her and Richard and Swarbrick and Ashley, and obviously Simon as well, they'd come up with this thing, and I was kind of hanging in there and trying to help make it all sound good.
Concept album, and that was the reason why I was asked to join, to bring into the group traditional material and traditional methods of doing it. That was precisely the reason I was asked to join.
It's a brilliant record, and the concept is a combination of taking these traditional folk ballads, turning them into rock epics in the case of Tamlin and Matty Groves, and then supporting that by, you know, what I think is the greatest thing about Richard Thompson's songwriting, and indeed Sandy Denny's songwriting, the ability to write these songs in a contemporary setting that have this traditional resonance. And until you look at the songwriting credit, you might think that it was written 200 years ago. And both Sandy and Richard had that, and it really came to flower on Liege and Leaf, with Sandy writing Come All Ye, and Richard with Farewell, Farewell.
Ashley Hutchings was becoming fascinated where this music came from, and would often go up to Cecil Sharp House and root around to try and find a definitive version of a particular song. Back in 1969, for a rock and roll band, effectively, to go back to the tradition, to go back to source, it really was a revolutionary, very radical step.
Well, I've never thought that was an enormous musical step. I've always thought it was kind of an obvious thing, you know. And people talk about folk rock, and I'm afraid that's a whole area that I've kind of missed out on. My feeling is that those songs are actually the old songs, a lot of them, are rather complex rhythmically. And a lot of the actual attraction of the song is in the fact that they're inner rhythms as well as the basic pulse. And often the basic pulse is irregular because the songs were unaccompanied. So if you make them regular and put a rock beat to them, which is a regular pulse for dancing, then you iron out a lot of the subtleties. So in theory, it's not a great idea, in my opinion. But I must say that I thought Fairport did a great job. And I mean, the stuff with Swarbrick and the jigs and reels and the stuff that really has got a pulse is absolutely amazing, and it takes it into another league. Although, yeah, if I think about it, Legion Leaf was a fantastic album, and they did play with the time, and they did a lot of subtle things as well.
Despite the positivity surrounding the recording of Legion Leaf, creative fissures started to appear within the band. Denny was struggling with the hectic touring schedule and the length of time spent apart from her boyfriend, Trever Lucus. She was also uncomfortable with the traditional route being pursued by Fairport and began to heed Joe Boyd's advice that a solo career would suit her better. In November 1969, 1 month before the release of Legion Leaf, both Sandy Denny and Ashley Hutchings left Fairport Convention.
My understanding was of that whole pre-Legion Leaf, post-Legion Leaf thing, was she was persuaded to join a band because of how she sang and because of the songs she wrote. My understanding is this: we do Legion Leaf, it's a kind of a pivotal moment for the band, and it's a really pivotal moment for Ashley, who goes traditional music, Holy Grail, off he goes in one direction and wants to pull the band in that direction. Sandy, my understanding is that Sandy was kind of coming into her own with the songwriting thing and realized that she didn't want to do the folk singer thing anymore and went off in the opposite direction, and the band were left in the middle.
I think she was fed up with the travelling. She was very involved also with Trever Lucus, who was her boyfriend, later her husband. They weren't seeing much of each other. I mean, I remember one reason she said she quit Fairport was that she ended up as a spaced out brain on legs.
I remember having a bit of a break and going up to see some friends in Scotland and coming back from Scotland and being met by Richard and Simon at the airport, and we've got some bad news. I said, yeah, what's happened? I said, Ashley's left the group. I went, oh, God. He said, and Sandy's left the group. Oh, God. So, what are we going to do? Well, there's this bass player that we've heard about, that Swarbrick keeps telling us about. Blah, blah, blah.
She didn't want to, having done that concept album, continue to do concept folk albums. She wanted to do her own songs, which were much more personal to her. She wanted to sing about herself and how she felt, and it was that was an attitude which was prevalent, I think. You know, the wonderful American singer-songwriters of the time, you know, who were singing about their own state of play, and I think she wanted to be a part of that, and she was a part of that. And she was a wonderfully personal songwriter. Painted lovely pictures.
Despite admonishments from Joe Boyd, Denny elected not to launch a solo career upon her departure from Fairport, choosing instead to join her boyfriend Trever Lucus in forming a new band, Fotheringay.
I surmise that Joe told her that he could arrange for that to happen. in a bigger way, and for her to have her own group, in fact, which was what Fotheringay was. That was instigated by Joe. And I've no complaints. I mean, it was a good idea, and it got her to do more of her own stuff, which is what she wanted.
When she left Fairport, the obvious move would have been to go as a solo singer. And I know that's what Joe Boyd, the Fairport producer, and wanted her to do. I think Sandy didn't feel confident. I mean, throughout her career, there was this lack of confidence. She didn't have a great deal of confidence in herself as a singer, as a writer. So I think it was the idea of jumping ship into a solo career, leaving the sort of lads club of Fairport behind. She was very wary of that. The fact she wanted to spend more time with Trever Lucus, who went on to become her husband. He was, a very accomplished singer, songwriter, great knowledge of Australian music, folk music. Had been in a quite successful band called Eclection. So I mean, it made sense that the two of them should form a group.
I was first aware of Sandy's work when I was in a band called Eclection, and I had seen Fairport play on a few times around the circuit, and I think I met her once, and the connection for me was that Trever Lucus and Sandy became partners, and eventually husband and wife. But that's where it first started. So Trever became friendly with Sandy, and consequently we got to know her then. And when Trever and Sandy got a flat together in Chipstead Street in Fulham, and it was just one of those places everybody used to hang out. We'd just go there and talk, play music, drink wine, just like you do. And it was a great place to be. And through that, over a period of time, one night we discussed the possibility of forming a group together, and that became Fotheringay. The songs came to the band where initially Sandy had a collection of new songs that she wanted to try, and then I think when we started thinking in terms of the album, one thing led to another. Trever had a fine voice, and was sort of encouraged to use it, and so everything was very social in those days. It was not really a business-like thing. So everybody was sort of very generous to each other, and it's like, yes, okay, you can sing that song, and what can you? Yeah, you do this, you do that. Wasn't really any sort of forethought about what might work or not, and I think just over a period of time, rehearsals, it just all fell into place that way.
Say hello to Valerie, say hello to Marianne, send them all my salary on the waters of oblivion.
I mean, I love the band. There was a looseness in their playing that Fairports didn't have. And again, if you talk to Richard Thompson, his one criticism of Legion Leaf is that although on things like Tamlin and Matty Groves, it sounds like there are these sort of great instrumental jams going on, according to Richard, it is very, very tightly arranged, and he felt it was too tightly arranged, and it could have been looser, and there could have been more space. I think Fotheringay had that. I think the album is another significant advance in the flowering of Sandy Denny as a songwriter. I think there's some of her finest songs on there, such as The Sea and Nothing More. There's one traditional song on there, which is a tremendous version of Banks of the Nile. And, you know, actually, I thought Trever Lucus, her husband, who is much derided, really. You know, I mean, Joe Boyd describes him as a mediocre musician. Well, you know, he brought something to the party as well, and he was Australian, and he came up with the Ballad of Ned Kelly, and, you know, I think that's one of the highlights of the record. And, you know, Sandy clearly enjoyed working with Trever, although there were other problems within the band. But yeah, I mean, you know, I would make out a strong case for Fotheringay as not just a diversion in her career, but actually rather important, and a period that bequeaths us one very, very fine record that has never really had its due.
There was a gyp came over the land, he sang so sweet and gaily. He sang beneath the wildwood tree and charmed the great lord's lady. The lord he did come home, inquiring for his lady. She's gone, said the serving man, she's gone with the gypsy Davy.
I was never that enamoured with Fotheringay. I think Fotheringay was born out of her own insecurity. She should have made the blockbuster solo album. But she was just so riddled with insecurities herself. She didn't feel she could carry it off. She needed a band around her. She didn't want her own name out there. You know, she didn't have that kind of confidence in herself. And I think Fotheringay was a compromise. You know, it didn't really, for me, have that direction, that sense of purpose. I don't think she knew exactly what she wanted to do with it.
It's if you don't return with me, I swear you'll see me no more. The Lord did go home and kissed his own baby, and 6 months had passed away, he'd married another lady.
Fotheringay never made it on record for my money, but they were an interesting band. Steel I did a lot of gigs. We did a lot of two-handers, and they did some really interesting stuff. But there were those around her who didn't like it, who thought she should be a soloist. I don't know what you do about that. I don't know what you do about that. I think that the musician should be allowed to express his or herself the way they see fit. And sometimes I think managers get in the bloody way. They were developing into something quite interesting. In fact, I think something very interesting when a halt was called. Probably very interesting things would have happened if they'd have carried on, but they didn't. And that first album doesn't tell you how good they were, I don't think.
In late 1970, though Fotheringay had been formulating material for a new album, Denny announced that she was disbanding the group in order to pursue a solo career.
We were in the studio recording the second album, and we recorded maybe, I don't know, three or four tracks maybe, and really, I think the people handling Sandy's career, I think that they really, really wanted her to have a solo career. I think they felt that she was possibly wasting her time with a band when they could see so much potential for her. Which, you know, in some ways was right. She did have huge potential. And I think the only thing that stopped that potential going sort of all the way, so to speak, was her own nature. She was very loyal to the people that she was working with. She made a point of being friends and understanding us individually. She had lots of time for us. And it was important, I think it was very important for her to have people around her that she liked and trusted. And I think that's what she had. And for all our shortcomings as players at the time, I think she preferred that situation to the big the cold, hard world as it can be, with maybe you might have the best players in the world, but they might not necessarily be your true friends, if you like. You know.
In early 1971, after a farewell performance with Fotheringay, Denny was asked by Led Zeppelin to record a session for the Battle of Evermore. With the huge global appeal of Zeppelin, the recording was a chance for Denny to showcase her talent alongside a band that enjoyed considerable commercial success.
She'd won the Melody Maker Best Girl Singer Award for a couple of years running, and she'd literally bumped into Robert Plant at one of the awards ceremonies. And I mean, Zeppelin were, absolutely massive. I mean, Zepp 3 had just come out, and the anticipation for Led Zeppelin 4 was, I mean, they were the new Beatles. I mean, there was this incredible sense of anticipation about what Zeppelin were doing next. So Sandy appearing on Battle for Evermore, I mean, it should have got her an incredible profile and audience, but it's almost like she's jinxed, that it just didn't do it. I mean, she's still the only ever guest vocalist on the Led Zeppelin album. The most, one of the most successful British bands ever. She's the only ever featured vocalist, and yet probably 99 people out of 100 wouldn't know that.
And time will tell us
sort of know that she's on it, but it's not exactly sort of in your face, I think the way she looked at it was just something that she did. She was asked to do a sort of scat kind of thing, just sort of jamming in a way, and she did the best she could. None of us at the time were seasoned session players or anything like that. We didn't have a huge amount of experience in the studio, and so I think she just did the best she could, and it was fine. It was great, really, and still is.
In spring 1971, Denny began work on her debut solo album, The North Star, Grassman and the Ravens. Ironically, all the members of Fotheringay were enlisted to record the album, and Richard Thompson assisted in the production.
Well, it's the story of North Star Grassman was really sort of almost comical, because we had an unfortunate day in the studio when Sandy was forced to come in, and she was in tears. It was against everything that she believed in, but she had to come in and say that the band, she was leaving the band and she was pursuing her solo career, and everyone was gutted. But that's what happened. But we all remained friends, and we were the musicians that she knew and liked. And so anyway, I think she signed this contract as a solo career, and when the recording came up, she just asked us to do it. So we were sort of back in the studio, but not as Fotheringay, but as sort of session players, if you like, which is the other side of the coin. And I can only talk from personally from how I felt at the time. so it's sort of all like emotions. So we had this kind of little secure group that we liked, and then it was sort of ripped apart in the name of business and career and all the rest of it. And then we all had to go in and pretend nothing had happened and make North Star Grassman. And as much as I still loved all her songs and very fond of Sandy, something had split us asunder a bit, I felt, emotionally. So it was harder to get the same kind of feeling, if you like. It was that much harder.
When it was drunk, the ship it was sunk, the shot it was dead, all the sorrows were drowned, the birds they were clouds, the bright and the shrouds, and as we drew south, the mist it came down.
North Star Grassman is quite a difficult album. I mean, it's got some great songs on there, but it's probably Sandy at her most introspective and her most sort of lyrically obscure. So it wasn't the great solo leap that perhaps people were hoping for at the time. Which is why I think it was a shame that the second Fotheringay album was never made, because I suspect it would have ended up as a better record than North Star Grassman and the Ravens.
They stood upon the deck as the ship went out to sea. The wind it took the sails and left the land a memory. All upon the shore for to wonder why the sailor goes, all to close their eyes and wonder what the sailor knows.
One of the reasons North Star Grassman didn't sort of set the world alight was because, in a way, I mean, I could be wrong, but I felt that Sandy was very much a reluctant solo artist. She didn't really want to go there, and it was only through pressure, I think, that she was almost sort of forced to do that. Really, she was more than happy with a little group with Fotheringay and just doing that stuff. There was no ambition involved. It was just trying to make some nice music and hoping people liked it. Nothing more than that. And suddenly it was like, oh, you know, yeah, you know, you've got to live up to what you are. You're like voted #1 singer, and you know, you could be a big star and so on. And I don't think it didn't suit her. She just didn't want it, I don't think. So it was probably just equally as hard for her as it was for the rest of us to do it.
The North Star Grassman and the Ravens was both a critical and commercial failure, attracting the kind of indifferent response that Denny often found wounding. In March 1972, Trever Lucus began producing a follow-up album, on which Denny had been working since the previous November, and in September 72, the self-titled Sandy was released.
I think the thing about the Sandy album is they're just great songs. You know, I think Listen, Listen is a fantastic song. It's like that sort of carrying call that she did with Ashley on Legion Leave Come All Ye. It's that anthemic sort of involving song. It suits me well, Music Weaver. There's just some great songs on there. Also, very well chosen Dylan cover, Tomorrow Is a Long Time, was not known at the time. And one of Dylan's, I think, most haunting love songs, and she sings it beautifully. And the singing, the playing, very quite stripped back. The production, it's quite sparse, but she's got there's this richness to her singing.
And the fretful sailors calling out their woes as to the waves that tossed. Oh, they are all gentlemen.
Her kind of homage to Dylan, It'll Take a Long Time, which I think is on Sandy, is one of the best songs she ever wrote, I think. And it's a lovely vocal, very kind of reflective, mournful, sensitive vocal performance on that, very quiet, and a lovely track. You know, you listen to that late at night and you think, yeah, that's the Sandy I know and love.
I think the second album is stronger than the first. The songwriting is very fine. She's deliberately trying to be less introspective and, if not more commercial, certainly more accessible. I mean, I remember there's one track on it, Tony Blackburn even made his record of the week, I think. The David Bailey cover shoot. You know, I mean, there's we didn't use the word back in the early 70s, but you know, there's something of an attempt at a makeover going on here from the front cover onwards. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty successful. And if you had to single out one of her 4 solo albums, this is probably the strongest.
It's an album on its way somewhere, in the sense that it's probably not the best album she did by a long shot, but you can see that it's a bit directionless. You know, there's some trad on it, perhaps a little bit more traditional material than you would expect, but some fabulous songs that she's written. I mean, The Lady. It suits me well. Great songs.
That's just a great record. That one is, out of all her records, and there's lots of good ones, if anything deserves a spotlight put on it, to me it's that one. And that's not false modesty because I'm not on it. I just think it's the songs are just the songs are just incredible. She sings great, it sounds great, the accompaniment is just it's just a great record.
After the release of Sandy, an unusual twist occurred when Trever Lucus joined Fairport Convention. With Denny touring in the UK and America, as well as writing material for her next solo project, Like an Old-Fashioned Waltz, Fairport had once again come between her and Lucas, and in the winter of 1973, she decided to rejoin the band.
Well, she was I don't know, I can't remember now whether she was actually married to Trev, but she was, you know, girlfriend, and she wanted to be with him. When she was on the road and he wasn't in the band, so she would be unhappy. And when he was in the band and she was at home, she was unhappy. She wanted to be with Trever. So that was a big thing. And then a female voice in the band, and especially Sandy's, well, I mean, you'd have to be a raving lunatic to think anything other than brilliant.
With Denny back in the band, Fairport hit the road, performing a series of shows in the US as well as 2 nights at the Sydney Opera House, one of which was recorded for a live album released in 1974 as Live Convention. The gigs often followed an odd pattern, with large parts of the set occupied by Denny performing material from her new solo album, Like an Old-Fashioned Waltz.
I saw Sandy with Fairport around the time of just after she'd rejoined, and they do sort of Fairport greatest hits, but she would then take the piano and do stuff like Solo and Like an Old-Fashioned Waltz, which was great. I mean, it was, you know, 2 for the price of 1. I mean, it was a great show.
While you're in the mood for dancing, I'll play you Like an Old-Fashioned Waltz, you know. Roses are red and violets are blue, primroses pale on a velvet green, warm summer days by pool waterfalls, like the music we hear, though it seems we'll always hold dear like carols.
I think it's ironic that Like an Old-Fashioned Waltz came out, and again, I think a much underrated album. And again, I just cannot understand why that record is not better known. You know, I think it's got 2 of her best ever songs. I think Solo and Like an Old-Fashioned Waltz are just fantastic songs. You know, if any other British female singer did Like an Old-Fashioned Waltz, it would be, you know, it'd be on Desert Island Discs every other week. You know, it's a fantastic song, beautifully orchestrated, beautifully sung. It's got that lovely sort of melancholic, old-fashioned, empty ballroom feel to it.
It has that kind of triteness almost about it. Roses are red, violets are blue. That's how it starts, and yet it goes into something else, and you think, hang on a minute, it's not a nursery rhyme she's singing. She's actually singing something a lot deeper here, and yet it's kind of tweeness, but there's a kind of a darker, heavier undercurrent. Like an Old-Fashioned Waltz is actually my favourite Sandy album, certainly of her solo stuff. It includes, I think, the best song she ever wrote, which was Solo. It's my favourite Sandy Denny song because it has that ability. It's clearly about her personal life. It's about her being alone again, about splitting from bands. It's almost her realisation that she's destined to be alone personally and also in terms of a band. You know, that's her destiny almost.
There's a time to be talking and a time when it's no use. Right now I think things you say are not to come. I've just gone so long. Do you
It's one of those songs that will also, anybody can identify with, you know, those lyrics. Anybody can recognise the sentiments that she's singing about in the song. But it's also one of her best vocal performances. And, you know, at that time, some will say her voice had gone. You know, once her voice wasn't what it used to be when she didn't have that kind of purity that she had with Fairport first time around. And that may be true. but kind of that kind of cracked element, you know, that kind of lived-in feel that she'd acquired by that time, whether, you know, through the hard life she'd had, the hard drinking and all the rest of it, it does affect your throat. And that clearly had taken its toll. But I don't know, it invested her with something else, you know, that kind of real reality, I suppose, you know, and solo, when she sang solo and she hit those big notes, that was something that really, really cut home with that song. I think the song itself is a great song. I think her vocal performance on it is terrific, and I love the arrangement too.
The production, everything about that record is fantastic, and yet, you know, it just sold to the devoted few. It just seemed that Sandy couldn't get out of that sort of folky ex-Fairport ghetto, and then when she rejoins Fairport, it just almost compounds that. So I think she was, again, it's that jinx, it's that Sandy jinx. You know, she makes, you know, this fantastic record, and it sold, you know, reasonably well, and I think Emmylou Harris went on to cover Like an Old-Fashioned Waltz. But I mean, it seemed to be that whenever she or Fairport played a gig, they knew virtually everybody in the audience. You know, the audience was not expanding, and it must have been incredibly frustrating. You put all that effort into a record like, you know, Rising for the Moon or Like an Old-Fashioned Waltz, and it's still not doing it. And you must think, well, what, yeah, Christ, what else do I have to do? It must have been incredibly frustrating.
Like an Old-Fashioned Waltz finally appeared in June 1974, over a year after Denny had first begun its recording process. During such a lengthy delay in the album's release, Denny had firmly re-established herself in Fairport, joining the band in the studio to record the album Rising for the Moon.
Troublesome album right from the beginning, and with Glyn Johns producing. The sound and the material was very different from any of the others. Stands out. And you either like it or you don't. I like it, not all of it, but I like it. And I think Rising for the Moon's a good song too. You know, there was 4 or 5 other real good songs on it. But it was a troublesome album to make. I mean, halfway through, Dave Mattacks felt that he could no longer participate and left.
This was a contributing reason to me leaving. The world tour consisted of Sydney Opera House and a week at the Troubadour in Los Angeles. That was the world tour. We got back from that and got halfway through Rising for the Moon, which was looking like a good record, but at that stage I'd had enough. But it did seem like a good time. But as I think I mentioned earlier, again, you know, hindsight, blah blah. But it did seem like it was going to work, but I saw this element of a dichotomy between the Fairport instrumental side of Fairport and the way Sandy's songs were going, and I couldn't see it working. I mean, you could say I was kind of proven right by what happened after Rising for the Moon. And again, I'm not trying to say, well, I told you so. I don't mean it that way, but that's how it felt at the time. That when it actually happened, I think we all felt, oh yeah, this is very cool. Not just for the fact that it was Sandy and Trever, and that was good for them, but the spirit of it. You know, they'd be, oh yeah, great, you know, blah blah. And then you kind of look at it and go,
The spy in his own account, and his money was his health, all thrown to the dust by his very own hand. But his beauty lingered still beyond the draining of the sand.
I think that Ireland felt, you know, this is the one, with Sandy back on board, Glyn Johns producing, this is the one that will really help Fairport crack America, and that opens up whole new, literally a whole new territory for them. It was mid-70s, so there was a sort of, not quite British invasion, but I mean, you know, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Clapton were all touring America. Cat Stevens, very successful, all touring America. You know, Fairport could have gone out with Sandy, could have gone out opening for them, could have really built a reputation on the back of a strong record. I think, as ever with Fairport, if one lineup had stayed together longer than, you know, 20 minutes, they could have really consolidated and built on it. But personal reasons, musical differences, personality clashes, whatever, after Rising for the Moon, Fairport split, you know, I mean, it really was a joke in the music press at the time, you know, Fairport split again. They did seem to just seem incapable of staying together for longer than one album. And I think if that Rising for the Moon lineup had stayed together, I think it really would have helped them make inroads into America and would have made a real difference on, certainly on Fairport's career and ergo Sandy's career.
Rising for the Moon was released in June 1975. The press response was indifferent at best. After a brief UK tour, Fairport split. Denny began to cut an increasingly dispirited and self-destructive figure. She had taken criticism of the album personally and started to use drink and drugs to excess, putting strain on her relationship with Lucas.
The first time I interviewed her, or tried to interview her, I reviewed the Rising for the Moon album. I joined Melody Maker and I did the review of Rising for the Moon, which is very much her baby. In Ireland, the record company had invested a lot into that album. And I'd arranged to interview her on a certain day, and the paper, Melody Maker, came out with my reviewing it that day that I was to interview her. And I was kind of indifferent about it, you know. I think there were some great songs, and there were some pretty awful ones. And that's essentially what I wrote. And I went to Ireland to do the interview, and I kind of just saw her. She kind of just stomped out past me. She refused to do the interview because she just read my review and took umbrage about it. I did meet her a few times after that, and she forgave me, you know. But you know, she took criticism very personally. You know, that was her insecurity. But she could, yeah, the other times I met her, she was lovely. You know, she could be very warm, very bubbly, very funny, you know. She was great company when she was on form. I think she was, you know, from what you hear from talking to other people, she was an absolute pain in the neck to work with and to deal with a lot of the time. She clearly drank too much. She carried a lot of baggage. She was temperamental. But those people you talk to about her, they all loved her, and they always forgave her. You know, they had talk about her with tremendous affection.
I think if you're really aware of the songs she wrote, that really gives you a good picture. I hope I'm not upsetting anyone related to her or fans or friends when I say that I think her insecurities increased towards the time when she passed away. But when I met her, when I joined Fairport and I met her, she was very positive and just great fun and very, very bright. Obviously very, very talented, and just good to be around. The volatility and the kind of the insecurities that unfortunately increased, but when she was later on, but I remember a very positive person.
In the first place, lots of people drank a lot. You know, lots of singers and players drank a lot and smoked a lot and did whatever. That was the days. You know, that's what happened. With a lot of people, I mean, there was very few people to escape it. But Sandy, I believe, also had something medically wrong with her that meant that she got drunker quicker than anybody else. There was I read an article some time back. I couldn't tell you the names of things, but she produced some chemical that meant, you know, that with alcohol it was an absolute killer. And I think they more or less found that out to be right. That was her problem. So because she could get absolutely pissed on half a glass of wine. She said she didn't drink a lot. This is a misnomer. She gave the impression of drinking a lot because she was drunk, but it took nothing to make her drunk.
You know, it's said nobody looked out for her and she was allowed to drink herself into a stupor and so on and so forth. But I mean, that wasn't unusual. We just weren't aware at that time of these things in the same way that we are now. You know, you could say the same thing. Nobody looked out for Jimi Hendrix. Nobody looked out for Janis Joplin. Nobody looked out for Jim Morrison. It was what you did, and you know, you saw people around you abusing drink and drugs, and you were probably doing it as well, and you just encouraged them and said, yeah, wow, isn't she out of it? You know, it wasn't that the people around Sandy were particularly careless of her well-being. That's just the way it was at the time.
The biography of Sandy actually does Trever a criminal disservice. I want to say that, and I hope you put it in the fucking programme. It does him a criminal disservice, because that man looked after her. He caught her when she fell. He just did, he did everything he could to back her up. He really did. Supported her whatever, whenever. You know, he was a stalwart. He really was.
Lots of people, I think, tried to help. They were ignorant days, really. You know, nobody knew much about anything like that. And really, you could say she was a very, very lonely person. You know, she was the kind of person who would be lonely in a crowd. And people were not qualified to help. You know, people would try to help, but they weren't qualified.
Though Denny's return to Fairport had been short-lived, Island continued to back her solo career. In early 1976, Denny returned to the studio to begin work on what would be her final album, Rendezvous.
The Rendezvous sessions, from what I recall, were predominantly rhythm section plus orchestra and Sandy live. And on the negative side, Sandy was clearly going through a rather volatile period in her life on a lot of levels. But again, I was really impressed by the songs and her performances on that record. And I thoroughly enjoyed the tracks we cut at Basing Street with the orchestra live. I think there's some great stuff on there, and everybody played so good. Winwood's on there, again, Pat Donaldson. I think Dave Pegg played on some stuff. I feel it's a strong record, but she wasn't going through a good phase personally, and I felt for her.
The release of Rendezvous was delayed for nearly a year as Island took stock of the radically changing musical landscape of the late 70s. When in May 1977 the album finally appeared, it was to a tepid critical response, a response which Denny again took badly.
I actually interviewed her around that time, that she had Rendezvous kind of waiting in the wings to come out, if you like. And she was very proud of it. I seem to remember her saying that she felt it was her best solo album, at least. It was probably out of time, you know. It was probably the timing was all wrong.
I remember Rendezvous coming out because I was freelancing for the NME at the time. Hard to believe now, but I was a hip young gunslinger. I started freelancing in '76. So Rendezvous came out, I thought, oh, you know, great, Sandy Denny, oh, wow, you know. So I went to interview her at the old Island offices in St Peter's Square. And I sort of sensed that there was a bit of bitterness about Island dragging their feet over Rendezvous. I mean, the landscape had changed so much. I mean, I guess we'd sort of seen and heard Sandy promoting Rising for the Moon. That would have been 75, 76. And then in that sort of 2 years, punk had come along, and of course Ireland were a bit slow off the mark on the punk. I mean, then they had Eddie and the Hot Rods. But I mean, they were certainly giving more priority to Sparks and Roxy Music and Bob Marley than they were to Sandy Denny. And I seem to remember that was implicit when I interviewed her.
Here comes the morning, how it possess. It always brings something new. Its golden light will wash away the dust of yesterday. If I try, it may let me forget you.
Rendezvous is a bit of a sad swan song. I mean, you know, I found it very hard to forgive her doing Elton's Candle in the Wind. Too many strings on there. You know, it's not the Sandy Denny that I wanted to hear. She's being pushed too much in a middle-of-the-road direction, certainly for my tastes.
And I won't be singing anymore sad refrains.
When I talked to her, she was kind of very up about it and felt that, you know, she was back and it was all gonna happen for her again. She was very optimistic. That's my memory of talking to her at that time. She was very optimistic about that album and that period. She was going to go back on the road, and, you know, this time she was going to get it right, you know. And I believed her. I really believed her. I thought it was going to happen because the songs are pretty good on that record. But somewhere down the line, whether it's the record company, you say, you know, didn't believe in it enough, whether the time had gone, people had moved on, the public wasn't interested in it, you know. She was kind of perceived as a hangover from folk rock in the, you know, late 60s, turn of the 70s, you know. It was just didn't work out for her. The pieces just didn't fall together.
Hardly ever do people go into a recording studio and go, oh yeah, that's okay, that'll do. The people we're talking about here kind of, you know, they really put it on the table and they try. And when you read a 2-paragraph negative thing, that it's tough, you know. And if your personality is a little fragile, which, if we're all honest, most of us who do this, you know, not too many are. You know, there's not too many of us like that, and I'm suspicious of a lot of them that are. It's one thing to be confident, but. And Sandy was fragile, and I think her fragility increased over those few years.
In 1978, having been dropped by Ireland and suffering from depression after the birth of her daughter, Georgia, Denny's drinking escalated dramatically. Following a serious fall at her parents' house, Sandy Denny suffered a brain hemorrhage, and on the 21st of April 1978, she died.
When we got the news, well, I suppose it's common knowledge, you know, what the situation was and everything else, and I think it was actually Trever and I think I drove Trever to the hospital. You know, it was just all over, and funeral, just shocking, totally devastated everybody. Yeah, dreadful thing. And I suppose everybody always said, oh, you know, they got so used to Sandy drinking and so on, and thinking, oh, well, you know, she's drunk. She's just that. Nobody, I don't think anybody really realised that she was not well. That was actually something wrong, and that she was disguising that more than anything else. I think that was what shocked everybody.
Well, it's certainly it's a blow to music. It was a blow to her friends. When she was suffering, she really was suffering. When friends die, I tend not to think about what they might have done in the future. I tend to think quite simply of what's happened to them and what led to it, and so I think about things they've done in the past.
She really was special. I mean, I really think she was up there. I mean, Richard said this, and I'm quoting Richard Thompson. Dusty Springfield, Sandy Denny. You know, two of the best singers from that broad time period that's come out of this country. There's really great singers, and it's disappointing to me and a lot of people that there isn't not a little more attention focused.
She had that kind of sorrow, melancholy in her voice that really kind of touches you. I don't think there are many people in this country or anywhere else come to that have that quality, that can really get to you the way she did. Very rare. And one of the tragedies is that it went largely unrecognised. And I still don't understand why she's not really been rediscovered.
To me, she was the finest female singer of her generation, and possibly the finest British female singer in a folk rock mode ever. And she made some wonderful, wonderful music and records that I'm still playing 30 years on, and I'm sure will go on playing for the rest of my life. And yet, there is still that feeling that there could have been so much more.
We lost the ability to go to concerts and to hear her sing. And that was an experience. And I lost the ability to be able to play with her, you know. But music had already had a lot from Sandy, you know. I mean, she gave everything to music. Everything. And in the end, her life.